I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. Delhi is burning. More than 20 people have been killed since the worst violence witnessed in decades broke out in India's capital. But the country of 1.3 billion people didn't get here overnight. On today's show, we try to look at how underlying factors such as the reworking of a national narrative and the otherizing of minorities has carefully cultivated a fertile atmosphere for mob and state violence. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Ravi, who's a political analyst joining us from Mumbai. Also joining us today is Dr. Ilhan Niaz, who's the professor of history at Quaid-e-Azam University. He joins us from Islamabad. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Ravi, since you're close to the ground as to what is happening right now, please tell us how events have unfolded since violence first broke out on Monday.
Meshal, 20 people have already lost lives in Delhi. 200 people are injured, and out of that, at least 25 are severely in a critical condition, admitted in various hospitals of Delhi. What I would like to highlight here is that a protest which had started as an anti-CAA, NPR, NRC protest has been converted into a full-fledged Hindu-Muslim riot now. It is happening in Delhi, right under the nose of the government of India, where the police administration, everything is under the control of the Home Minister of the India, Mr. Amit Shah. And the police is becoming a silent spectator to the whole thing which is going on. The goons of the RSS and BJP have unleashed terror in the town in Delhi, in the capital, the national capital. And last 2 days, when the President of America, Mr. Donald Trump and his wife were visiting India, I hope they have witnessed what is happening in Delhi. Another critical thing is that there are 8 MLAs who have been elected to Delhi Assembly in the recent election. There are 70 seats, out of which 8 MLAs have been elected from the northeast and the east of Delhi. And entire violence is confined to that area only.
Right,
this is Gopalpuri, this is Bhajanpura, Mustafabad, and all those places.
Right,
yeah,
Mr. Ravi, you were saying that this is happening right under the government's nose in Delhi. How has this violence, and has it at all, sparked a domino effect of sorts in other parts of the country?
I think this is exactly the game plan of the ruling dispensation in India. They want to escalate it to a Hindu-Muslim riot across the country. And this will definitely have a very, igniting effect across the country, because the anti-CAA, NPR, NRC protests are going on across the nation. More than 6 elected assemblies have already passed a resolution that they will not be implementing the provisions of these acts. So this is definitely going to be very, there will be a repercussions across the country, and the nation is on boil. This is already, I hope you recall that a place called Shaheen Bagh in Delhi, where the protests are going on for last 72 days, but no violence had taken place over there. Instead, in last 2 days, some BJP goons, some BJP ministers, elected constitutional leaders like Anurag Thakur, like one Kapil Mishra, like Mr. Pravesh Sinha, and all that. They made all, fueling fire.
They have made provocative
speeches, and they have ignited this communal tension over there.
Right. Mr. Ravi, stay with me. I want to jump to Dr. Ilhan Niaz and talk to him about this, dig a little deeper. Dr. Ilhan Niaz, if we look at the visuals, and we'll show an example of those visuals on the screen in just a moment, of what is happening. It's senseless violence, but we know that in every area, in every context, for violence to come about, for violence to be fueled, there is a specific history that goes into it. In India's case, how do you see that happening and getting to this point right now?
Well, first of all, the violence isn't senseless in the sense that it is there for very, very good political reasons from the perspective of the ruling party. And it serves a very important purpose in terms of polarizing the polity into an in-group and an out-group along lines consistent with the ideology of the BJP and the RSS. So in that sense, what we are seeing is the implementation of an ideologically driven agenda. And in that sense, what is happening in India for the last several months since the CAA issue came up, and what has, of course, been happening since August in Kashmir as well, is precisely the implementation of, I would say, a pretty well thought out idea of how to go forward in terms of communalizing India's polity effectively along lines that the BJP wants. So there are many, historical examples of this in the sense of, the use of mob violence in order to consolidate political power, in order to intimidate likely opponents. And this kind of violence we see happening sometimes in democracies. More often than not, we see this type of violence in authoritarian states. The United States is an important exception in the sense that in the United States, especially in the southern United States, there was something like 4,000 organized lynchings of African Americans in what is called the Jim Crow South. But this is, again, something that is planned, and it may look chaotic on the screen, but there is an order behind the chaos.
Great. As you're quoting these examples of mob violence, of course, it's essential to ask, how does a mob come to this point? Of course, there is political engineering at the back end, but how does a mob come to commit this violence? What roles and what factors are needed in terms of creating a sort of a narrative which sticks?
Well, there are obviously different types of rioting and different types of mob violence. So sometimes you can end up with mob violence in response to, let's say, an outrageously unjust decision by a government or by an institution. A good example of this would be the LA race riots after the police officers who beat up Rodney King were essentially let off scot-free. But you also can have mob violence that is a recurring pattern, and that is driven by deep-seated racial or religious hatreds. Hence the example I gave earlier of lynchings in the southern United States, where white supremacists, often with the support of the government, would go around meeting what they saw as racial justice to African Americans for, in their view, doing something as outrageous as drinking from a water fountain that was supposed to be only for white people, or for a black man, or to have a white girlfriend or something like that. So you have that sort of enforcement of racial obligations in the view of the white supremacists, and that is, the lynching was an important sort of message. The other key element of course, mob violence that is perpetrated with the connivance of the state is that its purpose is to terrorize those who are its victims into realizing that the state and its institutions are not going to protect them. In fact, another very good example of this type of mob violence took place in Austria, referenced the Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass, in November 1938, where in response to the assassination of a Nazi German diplomat, the Nazi authorities orchestrated the killing of at least 100 Jews and the destruction of thousands of their businesses and homes. And then it basically punished them for the riot. It put about 30,000 of them into concentration camps straight away. So this is similar to that in the sense that you see a targeting of certain areas, as your other guest pointed out. And all of that indicates that the message that the BJP wants to go out is that it's our way or the highway.
Right, our way or the highway. Mr. Ravi Srivastava, as we're talking about this violence being carried out, Muslims aren't the only minority that have been targeted in Modi's India. Till 2019, ADF reported 1,400 cases of violence against Christians. Amnesty International documented plenty of cases against Dalits. But why do we see an amplified form of violence against Muslims specifically? How was this other created as the ultimate other for being the recipient or being the target of this violence?
I agree with you, Meshal, but the point here is that in India, Mr. Modi and Amit Shah, this is the second round once they won the election, they started with a particular agenda. That agenda was, removing the triple tariff, they're removing 320, abolition of 370, then Ram Mandir construction, and that last, the CAA bill, which has caused lots of unrest among people. The point is that this particular bill is discriminatory, this act is discriminatory, and named as a black law by many people. It is not only that the Muslims will be affected by this particular law. The government has made it between Hindu and Muslim, and some mosque has been, destroyed in Delhi, and some people of the minorities and all, they have been dragged on the road and they have been, killed and all. A lot of videos are circulating on the social media.
Mr. Ravi Srivastava, as we're talking about all of this being documented, we're seeing all of this unfold on our TV screens. What is the community level impact at this moment? How is this unfolding? How is this insecurity unfolding in real time on the ground?
It is definitely very scary, because I am getting a lot of messages from my friends who are based out of Delhi on phones and all, that they are calling the police, but the police is not reaching out to them, and police is just keeping an eye closed. I'll tell you one more thing: these riots do not happen spontaneously. The riots are planned. There were truckloads of these, tempo loads of these stones being carried out over there. People are flashing guns over there. People are having all kind of ammunition and the kind of swords and all those things they are flashing over there. And the police is just watching the whole thing silently. That shows the connivance of the state with the rioters. And that is how it is, has culminated into a death of so many people, and so many people have been severely injured. But I think that this is the high time an international community should immediately condemn India's action.
Right, Mr. Ravi Srivastava, stay on that point. That's something we're going to talk about later on. What are the international mechanisms, if any, that can allow any form of intervention? But Dr. Ilhan, Niaz, when we talk about this, the violence and the exertion of power in this manner, of course, it does establish a power dynamic, but it also creates chaos. From history, what have we learned? How does mob violence weaken governance overall? I mean, does this set a very dangerous precedent for the future in terms of the government itself?
Well, again, it depends a little bit on the government, the nature of the government, and how that government intersects with the violence itself. So if we look at, let's say, the example of lynchings in the South, in the United States prior to the Civil Rights Act, then there mob violence was an essential component of maintaining the racial laws and the racial order of that society. So the use of lynching, the use of mob violence can actually further the purpose of a government, even if in the short term it leads to a certain amount of destruction or chaos. Reference India, I think if we look at what happened in Gujarat back in 2002, there what we again basically see is that notwithstanding the fact that many hundreds of people were killed, and notwithstanding the fact that the state authorities, the local authorities were complicit in what happened, the BJP reaped a very rich political reward, and that event sort of launched Narendra Modi on the path to becoming the Prime Minister of India. So in that sense, there was a reward, not punishment, for what they did.
For what happened in Gujarat.
Even the court basically gave Narendra Modi a clean chit. The Special Investigation Tribunal, I think it was called, basically cleared him of any responsibility for what had happened, which was, an incredible.
Mr. Ravi, when we talk about Gujarat and what happened there, has it impacted national memory at all?
Absolutely. The memories of Gujarat were very painful, and the same people who had perpetrated those kind of riots over there now are ruling the country. The person who was the chief minister is the prime minister here. The man who was a state minister, home minister there is a country's home minister today. So that's not exactly the same thing. What people are perceiving is that it's a Gujarat model now being extrapolated in the entire nation, and the same way they are dealing with it, because that was also a state-sponsored kind of a thing. The police was keeping quiet, and more than 1,500 minorities were brutally killed over there. So this is what, and that's giving a very scare and a fear among the minorities in the country, because they know that the same people are ruling the country today, and a similar kind of scenario
violence will repeat itself. History will repeat itself. That's the main fear. We're joined by Dr. Lubna Sarwat, who's the Secretary General of the Socialist Party in the Telangana state. She joins us from Hyderabad. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Lubna Sarwat. When many segments of society re-elected Modi, were they anticipating what is happening now?
This was anticipated, and the only silver lining is that just a few minutes back news is that the High Court has told that all the hate speeches, complaints against all the hate speeches by BJP or any party has to be immediately filed and taken up by the police. But this is too late, and at the same time it is too little, because we knew that all this was coming when each person was, they were shooting openly towards the Shaheen Bagh protesters, to any protesters who are peacefully protesting. And even now, even today afternoon on another channel, the BJP people, the ruling party, are spreading so much of hatred, towards either the other political parties or towards people who are anti-CAA and anti-NPR and anti-NRC. This is a democracy, and when people are protesting, there was no government outreach to them. That itself shows that they are not abiding by what they are elected for. And they are openly telling that how come when the parliament has passed and Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha has passed, how come they are disagreeing with it? Who said? Just recently, Justice Chandrachud, who is a very senior judge, and Justice Ashok, both of them have openly told to the entire country, to the whole world, that the government need not always be wrong. And that is true. And that is why they should be dissent. If there is no dissent, there is no democracy then. And when they are dissenting, till now nobody has reached out to them. And in fact, उनके ऊपर गोली चलाओ कि मिनिस्टर लोग नारे करे और गोली चलाई गई. तो ये गोली जो कल एक इंस्पेक्टर हमारे एक ऑन ड्यूटी हमारे इंस्पेक्टर भी कोई शहीद हो गए थे, इवन कांस्टेबल शहीद हो गए थे. Even that is all, you know what? Everything is now gone out of hand. It's looking like it's going out of hands actually. But I think the civil society.
Right, and when you're mentioning the civil society here, Dr. Lubna Sarwat, I just want to go back to the ruling you mentioned here and giving a responsibility to the police. Mr. Ravi Srivastava briefed us earlier on the control the police has and the fact that the police itself has been documented to be complicit in many acts of violence. Is that a trustworthy institution anymore?
Yeah, that's a main issue. Has been conniving with the state, and another thing is taken a cognizance of that. It is very too little and too late. Funny was that the government speech made by the BJP leaders, which court had to play the trial. They said that this is here, it has been on every TV channel, and you could not see it. This is very surprising. So that's the situation question here that even the judiciary is now reprimanding the government that you should be proactive, you should be taking action against those who are guilty. But
right.
you are not.
Mr. Ravi Srivastava, sorry to intervene here, but we're running short on time, and I want to get a quick question into Dr. Lubna Sarwat and ask her here. As you mentioned, Dr. Lubna Sarwat, the role of the civil society, how has it been so far, and what do you see happening now after this dark turn of events?
Yeah, no, I think even now, did you observe that even now the Supreme Court has not stepped in? That's the sad part of it. And when the Home Minister has to take the entire responsibility, the Prime Minister should have asked him to resign by now. The Supreme Court should have actually taken stock of the situation suo motu. None of those things are happening. And only the High Court, the Delhi High Court judge has told that we don't want to have a 1984 report and we will not allow that to happen. These are such strong statements that should come from the government of India. We are not seeing a single statement. And Amit Shah's Home Minister has conducted 3-4 meetings within a gap of 24 hours, within a span of 24 hours.
Right.
But where is the action? Actually?
Dr. Lubna Sarwat, I just want to get last comments from Dr. Ilhan Niaz as well. As we're seeing the situation unfold, of course, nobody has a crystal ball, but trying to speculate about what is going to happen in the coming days. What do you see unfolding for the civil society?
I think that basically when it comes to this kind of organized violence, there is not that much that unarmed civil society can do in the face of this kind of thing. The best, of course, they can do is to try to challenge the narrative the government is trying to build, provide relief to people that have been affected by the rioting. But that, of course, would put the civil society members themselves in harm's way. So in that sense, there isn't much that civil society can do independently of cooperation by the government. And since the government is itself instigating the situation, right. Civil society does not have the power to stop it.
Right. That, of course, paints a very bleak picture of the future of India, and we're going to have to wait and see how the situation unfolds. But thank you so much, Dr. Ilhan Niaz, for joining us from Islamabad, Mr. Ravi Srivastava for joining us from Mumbai, and Dr. Lubna Sarwat for joining us from Hyderabad. As tensions continue to boil in India, we will have to wait and see how the situation unfolds, and we will continue to do so. But before that, we have to go for a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show while we discuss what is unfolding in India. And we also take a look at the psychological aspects of what is happening, what's happening on media coverage, especially social media, and also from the international legal point of view. Can there be international intervention in what's happening right now? Joining us for this discussion is Waheed, who is a research associate at the Research Society of International Law. She joins us from Lahore. Also joining us is Mr. Philip Ingram, who's a journalist specializing in the security and intelligence arenas. He joins us from Birmingham. Also joining us in the studios is Dr. Shoaib Shahid, who's the founder and president of Psychological Foundation for Human Innovation at North Carolina University. He joins us in our Lahore studios. Thank you all for joining us, and welcome to the show. Mr. Ingram, let me begin with you. Now, as I mentioned, we are talking about the context of India. But when we look at the larger scheme of things, how has social media, specifically online digital media, played a role in developing conflict and also aggravating it?
It's nothing new. Over the last decade, I'll put a quote from 2011. The then British Home Secretary Theresa May said that social media was being used to coordinate criminality and stay one step ahead of the police. And that was relating to riots in London at the time, caused by the police shooting dead an individual from one of the minority communities as part of an arrest operation. We've seen social media being used to coordinate activities around the globe, including the Arab Spring. BlackBerry Messenger was one of the favorite platforms at the time, but we've seen it in more recent years with the coordination of the riots in Hong Kong and elsewhere. It is a platform to be able to get a mass message out to people very quickly. In June 2010, in Egypt, videos posted to Facebook were often shared with 50,000 people or by 50,000 people on their wall.
Right. Mr. Philip Ingram, now when we look at what is in India, and especially the fact that a lot of our guests in the previous segment as well reiterated that the violence is systematic, it is organized. This organization, of course, happens at the back end of what's happening. What role do you think, if any, social media firms and companies can play when they see an alarm, they see international monitoring organizations stating that there's a high chance of violence occurring there, there's a high chance of minority persecution happening?
This is a very difficult balance between freedom of speech and between stopping the enablement of criminality. And it's something that I think the social media giants haven't quite got their head around, but I don't think many of the governments around the world have quite got their head around as to where that line is. So where you can understand where people have overstepped that mark, and the social media giants should then come in within a legal framework and stop activities from happening. And often it's very difficult for them to police that. With the modern social media platforms such as WhatsApp, some of the groups where this can be coordinated in are encrypted, end-to-end encrypted groups. Even the social media giants can't see the content in those groups, so they don't know that it's going on. So it's great in theory to say it's there, get the social media giants
Ingram,
to take it down.
sorry to eject here, but when we see the case of Myanmar, where Facebook was complicit, the United Nations put this out, that Facebook was complicit in a genocide, and this was, of course, engineered by the government. It was engineered by many groups. Has it learned anything from that instance?
I wouldn't necessarily say Facebook was complicit, but Facebook was used and they haven't policed it enough. I think the social media giants in the last 12 months have started to take or get a much greater understanding of their responsibilities and not just suggest that the responsibility lies with the people who are putting the content that's up. And we're seeing that in the way that they have approached dealing with terrorist content online. That then has to expand further to levels of protest or criminality that's going on. But those definitions have to be agreed internationally and then within governments, because we're getting onto a very fine line between what is freedom of speech and enabling freedom of speech and what is making sure that we're stopping criminality. And state control of that also brings with it a number of risks.
Right. Noor, as we heard Mr. Ingram talk about that fine line between freedom of speech and then trying to stop criminality, what is the legal perspective on this? What does international law say about this?
Well, as we know that presently, India is violating its international human rights obligations under the ICCPR, which is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which says that there should be no discrimination on the basis of religion. And the CAA is unprecedented as a legislation in the history of India that is making this very intense discrimination on the basis of religion. Because what it's doing is it's basically criminalizing being a Muslim. It's criminalizing being an illegal immigrant of Muslim origin and of Muslim affiliation.
Right. And when you say that, of course, unprecedented, when we talk about laws and the framework in which they are created, and especially when we talk about laws which are specifically discriminatory, what outlines exist in the formation of laws when it comes to minorities, something that's governed not just by India's constitution, but also by the wider international legal architecture?
So in this case, this does fall under a refugee issue. So the alleged purpose of this legislation was to deal with the issue of illegal immigrants. But what makes it extremely condemnable under international law is that it is a blatant violation of international human rights law. So there are mechanisms in place, there are international laws in place, such as the ICCPR, the International Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and this law goes against all of that. There is also the customary international law obligation for non-refoulement, which prevents India from expelling anyone, illegal immigrant, whomever have you, from the country if they fear prosecution. And India has already set a precedent by doing that once before with the Rohingya Muslim. But what they are doing is a violation of international law, and they have been facing condemnation from the EU, for example, or the U.S. Commission
Noor,
on
stay with me. Stay with me on that. I want to get to that in just a bit. There is a lot of talk about whether there's any possibility of international intervention, but I want to jump to Dr. Mohammed Shahid here. Dr. Shahid, as we're seeing, the violence is widespread and there is systematic factors at play in this instance. But how does this actually happen? How are people convinced that this is the right way to go? What happens in a society to desensitize such a massive amount of people and allow them and enable them to move towards violence?
You know, before answering to these questions, we have to see what is the human nature. And particularly when there is a collective unconscious, the people living together, they have developmental picture. These are neighbors, this or this. When such kind of discrimination takes place, then they appear a state of anxiety, uncertainty. And sometimes under such kind of harassment condition, there is one have to go either to fly or to fight. But make it clear that nobody can stop the human nature.
But what makes a minority become a threat to the majority in which they feel like they have to fight them? I mean, flight is not even an option, but to fight them. What process goes on, let's say, from the point of view of narrative creation, from the point of view of otherization?
Yeah. You know, what you are talking about, to me it looks that you want to see minority who are under pressure and they are treated like this way. What they have ultimate, reaction to this situation. Am I right? If it is so, first keep in mind the human nature is human nature. Without discrimination of, religion or caste or this and that. But when their question appeared of minority and majority, then the minority is feeling insecurity and they will be more close to each other to save themselves. But it is quite sure they may go to an extreme reaction and they may have no control on their psyche, and whatever government may do, they will keep on doing because it is a question of survival.
Right. Yeah. Mr. Ingram, now India has a massive population, 1.3 billion people. It has a massive market for social media, for many other instances. In this, when we talked earlier about the threat that is online in terms of trying to organize crime and trying to organize violence, how difficult is it for such a huge market to be monitored and to be controlled?
It's extremely difficult. The police and security services are set up for traditional threats. The UK itself, the single biggest crime area, is enabled through the internet, but one of the smallest levels of policing is in the internet and into cyberspace. This is something where I think the police are always trying to play catch up on. It shouldn't be difficult in the main social media platforms for the police to be able to monitor what is going on. Even in some of the encrypted platforms, they just have to use different techniques to what is within normal policing to get into them.
That's very interesting. I feel like a lot of our viewers are interested in knowing, when you say about those different techniques, what do you mean? And are there examples existing around the world that can be taken, learned from?
Well, it's good old traditional, going back to good old traditional intelligence gathering. And the thing that I would advocate is the use of human intelligence techniques in a cyber environment. We just have to recognize that cyberspace is just an extension of the physical space. And if you, and I'm a former intelligence officer, if I wanted to get into a closed company, I don't necessarily need to sit outside and tap my keyboard to get into it. The biggest vulnerability and one of the oldest professions is finding a spy that you can get and get into there. These are big groups. It's not difficult to get people in there to find out what's going on and then report it out to the authorities. And the authorities try and stay one step ahead. The greatest difficulty is that the reach that you can get through social media is so big. The numbers of people that can be moved, the levels of command and control and the speed that people can be moved at is such that it's going to be very difficult for any police force or security force anywhere to be able to react to that quickly enough, as was found in Egypt in 2010, as was found by the police in London in 2011 in dealing with the riots. And a lot of the time then it's trying to play catch up afterwards to deal with those individuals who have perpetrated criminality.
Right. Now, Noor, when we're talking about criminality here, and we're talking about various international organizations, even before this violence erupted, they have been continuously condemning what's happening in India, but also continuously talking about the threat to minorities there. That's without a doubt that everyone has been on board in trying to say that this environment is threatening. When we take a hold of that situation, is there anything that can happen in terms of foreign intervention in a case like this?
So there is a concept under international law known as the responsibility to protect, and it does sort of discuss the responsibility of states to come and intervene in a place where there are gross violations of human rights. An example of this would be the NATO intervention in Kosovo, for example. But in that case, there was brutal massacre, overt massacre of the Serbs in Kosovo, and that prompted the response from NATO to create the precedents for humanitarian intervention. Now, in the case of India, and in this particular case where you don't have the state, even though law enforcement is involved, and even though that is also a violation of one of the basic principles of use of force in law enforcement, which is a UN document of sorts, it hasn't escalated to such a state where it can be considered a genocide, for example, even though there are really harrowing examples such as the return of the Rohingya Muslims to Myanmar, where there is an active genocide taking place. But at this point, there's very little state practice and there is no provision, active provision, no written provision in international law that accommodates humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect.
Right. And that, of course, it hasn't escalated to that point where it is considered genocide. But when we talk about the state of statelessness within India, we're talking about the citizenships of millions of people being stripped away. In that case, is intervention important or essential? Because this is something that is not just constrained to India. It's going to impact the region.
That is 100% a concern, and the EU also passed a paper in which they did condemn this because the issue of statelessness would be a tremendous international security risk as well. But presently, there is very little state practice. If this does happen, if India is successful in formalizing and passing the CAA, it will be one of the largest issues of statelessness in recent history. So presently, there isn't any precedent in international law that enables that kind of thing, because there is like a sort of tension in the UN Charter, which prevents nation states from intervening arbitrarily or even for humanitarian purposes in another country, violating their sovereignty. But also, there is that focus and this push towards humanitarian intervention and protection of like greater human rights values.
Right, got that there. Dr. Mohammed Shahid, now when we're talking about the regeneration of violence again and again, what do you see happening when such violence is perpetrated and then you see plenty of media coverage about it? You see hate being spewed on media channels. How does that impact the next generation? How does that impact society at large, the anxieties that are created?
First of all, the present situation is you keep in mind how far you can use force to suppress a person. And whatever techniques you may use, media or other kind of forces, but to me it seems, according to human nature, they will remain restless because they have created a state of helplessness. When a person is in a state of helplessness, either he goes to depress or he react when they feel that we are going to be forced and suppressed, then they go underline activities to have outlet of their feeling and let them feel that we are here. In other words, you may say one goes to get attention through negative mean because positively nobody is caring. Media is not, there is so much presenting the material. West is seeing. I mean, if these things would have happened in Western countries, you would have seen a much, much different kind of reaction from the other world. But so these poor guys, they are under pressure. They are looking some hope. But when they see that politically the government is in power and they are crushing them, they just suppress for the time being, but they should forget it. They will keep on doing this till they are relieved from their trouble.
Right.
Make it sure That
Violence
they cannot
begets
suppress
violence in
that.
this.
And when you suppress, there is a reaction, aggression, and then, restlessness, anxiety. Those people who have been with them, their neighbors, they were, Hindus and other kind of thing. But when they saw they have with the government and they have created more problem with them, they are more disturbed.
Right.
You got it? And they have no trust on any person.
Right. And that is, of course, something that we are seeing and something that a lot of our guests reiterated, that the path continues to seem dark because the violence doesn't seem to be ending, and it doesn't seem like the political rhetoric which enabled this violence is ending. We're still seeing that being spewed out. Thank you so much, Dr. Mohammed, Shoaib, Shahid, for joining us here in the studios, Noor, Waheed for joining us from Lahore, and Mr. Philip Ingram for joining us from Birmingham. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.